All right, so there's a second familiar kind of argument for psychological egoism then. This one trades on the notion of satisfaction or peace of mind, right? I mean, as we just said, it's the thing that's suggested by the response to the first argument that says, oh, well, but look, Mother Teresa, she was just looking for satisfaction, right? So she was really selfish. Rachel's introduces this argument by citing this 19th century newspaper story that involves attributing the argument to Lincoln. Right? This is top of page 67. This is a passage from the Springfield, Illinois Monitor. Mr. Lincoln once remarked to a fellow passenger on an old-time mud coach that all men were prompted by selfishness in doing good. His fellow passenger was antagonizing this position when they were passing over a corduroy bridge that spanned a slough. As they crossed this bridge, they espied an old razorback sow on the bank making a terrible noise because her pigs had got into the slough and were in danger of drowning. As the old coach began to climb the hill, Mr. Lincoln called out, "Driver, can't you stop just a moment?" Then Mr. Lincoln jumped out, ran back and lifted the little pigs out of the mud and water and placed them on the bank. When he returned, his companion remarked, "Now, Abe, where does selfishness come in on this little episode?" "Why, bless your soul, Ed, that was the very essence of selfishness. I should have had no peace of mind all day had I gone on and left that suffering old sow worrying over those pigs. I did it to get peace of mind, don't you see?" So, I mean, sort of generalize that, right? And you get the idea that whenever people act, and in particular whenever they do apparently unselfish stuff, like Lincoln here, what they're really interested in is a kind of psychological benefit to themselves, namely satisfaction or peace of mind. In his treatment of this, Rachel's does not come very close to formulating the argument in a full way, but I have a formulation to give you. Indeed, I have two variant formulations to give you. I'll start with the first one, right? When you're putting this in your notes, you might leave a little space in premises 3 and 4, so that rather than writing out the whole of the second thing, you can just note the variations in premise 3 and 4 to get the second alternate argument. Let's start with the first version. Okay, so this is the PowerPoint. As you can see, we start with the same first premise that we had before, and we can defend it the way we did before if it's criticized as well. But then we diverge and we start focusing on this notion of satisfaction. This, I take it, is a valid argument. The question is it sound? Let me raise that question initially anyway this way. Which premise of the argument I just gave you seems to you most problematic, most vulnerable to criticism?
I'd say premise 3 is...
Premise 3, I think you're exactly right, yes. Yes. So, and that's the premise, you know, that if doing something brings you satisfaction, then that satisfaction is your only goal. Indeed, the most, you know, the figure in the history of philosophy such that the sort of description attached to him is, you know, critic of psychological egoism, standardly, is the 18th century philosopher and theologian Joseph Butler. And one way to read, or one thing to get out of some of Butler's writings on psychological egoism is the thought that, you know, premise 3 in this sort of argument isn't merely false, it's in a way sort of necessarily false. Here's the way Butler develops that line of thought. He says, look, what's satisfaction? Satisfaction is something you get when you get something else that you wanted, right? You don't feel satisfied that the Cubs win a game unless you wanted the Cubs to win a game. You don't feel, you know, satisfied that the lawn is mowed unless you wanted the lawn mowed, right? In that way, Butler's idea is, you know, you only get satisfaction if you wanted something else as well. That is, put that a slightly different way, if you had some other goal as well. And that means, he suggests, that it's really impossible for satisfaction to be your only goal, right? I mean, in order to get satisfaction, you need to want something else as well. Right? You need something else, as it were, to get satisfaction from. So, I mean, as I say, if Butler is right about that, then premise 3 of the argument we just gave is sort of necessarily false, right? I mean, you know, satisfaction is not the kind of thing that you can anyway successfully have as your only goal. I don't think, though, that that's the end of the story for this sort of argument, right? Because, as I said, I think, you know, then if you're formulating it, the natural next move is to say, okay, so maybe there's something else we can do with this here premise 3, right? Maybe it doesn't have to say, if doing something brings you satisfaction, that satisfaction is your only goal. Yeah? There are, I think, then, natural ways to sort of revise the argument, weaken premise 3, to avoid that Butler criticism and, you know, still capture the idea. Now, let me find it here just a minute. So here's a version, right? Here's a revised version of the argument. If we nip over to the PowerPoint, yeah, could we pop to the PowerPoint shot? Great. Hopefully you don't have to write this all down, right? If you left a bit of space, as I said before, just notice it's only 3 and 4 that are different here. So, you know, I mean, you can write the whole thing out if you want, but there may be a way to do it such that you just note by, you know, 3 and 4, revised version, replace, you know, only goal with one, you know, her only goal with one of her goals, you know, premise 4 again, replace only goal with one of your goals. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, you're free to, you know, you can write the whole thing out if you want as well, that's fine, but I mean, that's the thing to notice about it, right? It's just like the original version, but we've changed we've weakened the goal stuff in 3 and 4. Yeah. All right, so by making these revisions, we avoid the Butler criticism, right? We've no longer got the version of premise 3 that left the argument open to that attack suggested by Butler. Still, I want to say the argument fails. I want to say that even in its new version, premise 3 is false, and I want to say also now, in a way, in the new argument, premise 4 is problematic in a way that premise 4 of the original argument was not problematic. Start, though, with the problem for premise 3. What I want to say is, the fact that doing something brings you satisfaction does not automatically entail that it's one of your goals. It may be, but it doesn't have to be. Right? To see that, consider sort of two variants of the Lincoln story, the actual version and another conceivable one. Right? I mean, the actual version in the story we've got, you know, the Rachel's quotes from the... Oh, don't put that up yet. Oh, can we go back to me? Cool. We'll come there. We'll get there, but I want to explain it before I do it. Thanks. In the actual version of the story, right, the one that got quoted from the Springfield, Illinois Monitor and stuff, what happens is, right, Lincoln sort of sits in the back of the coach and he stews and he thinks, you know, boy, I'm going to have a terrible afternoon unless I go, you know, save those pigs. So, you know, that thought about how he'll feel, that thought about, you know, his satisfaction or peace of mind, clearly plays a role in motivating him, right? So I want to say in that case, yes, it's clear that satisfaction is indeed one of his goals. Right? But then the point is, look, it didn't need to have happened like that, right? Here's another version of the story, right? Not the one that's in the Monitor and not the one that would illustrate, you know, Lincoln's point trying to argue for psychological egoism, but nonetheless a possible story, right? So it just goes like this, right? So Lincoln's in there, in the coach, sees the pigs, wants to help, asks the driver to stop, gets out, pulls the pigs out of the slough and gets back in. And it never even occurs to him to think at any point in that process, at least until he's sitting back down in the coach, how he'll feel afterwards, right? He just, you know, immediately wants to help and takes the steps and does it. Seems to me that, too, is a perfectly possible psychological story. That's how we're motivated sometimes. Right? So, and I mean, in that second case, I mean, Lincoln would presumably still be satisfied afterwards, right? So the point there is, look, the fact that something brings you satisfaction doesn't entail that satisfaction is even one of your goals. I mean, it can be. You make it one of your goals if the sort of process of thought that precedes your action includes your thinking about and focusing on and being motivated by how you'll feel afterwards. And we're motivated by that sometimes, right? That's a possible motivational story. But that's not how we're always motivated. Sometimes we act much more immediately, without reflecting on how we'll feel afterwards, without worrying about whether we'll feel satisfied. And if we do that, then satisfaction isn't even one of our goals, right? So even this new version of premise 3, according to which, you know, if something brings you satisfaction, then that's one of your goals, still wrong, right? All right, the other thing is that now in this new version of the argument, premise 4 is problematic, right? this thought is suggested in effect by what Rachel says in criticizing this argument. I mean, I guess I don't feel that Rachel's discussion here is sort of terribly thorough or discriminating, but he does make some useful points, right? I mean, here's the main thing he says by way of criticism, right? This is page 68, first full paragraph. He says, despite all this, Lincoln's argument is badly flawed. It may be true that one of Lincoln's motives in saving the pigs was to preserve his own peace of mind. But the fact that Lincoln had a self-interested motive doesn't mean that he didn't have benevolent motives as well. In fact, Lincoln's desire to help the pigs might have been even greater than his desire to preserve his own peace of mind. And if this isn't true in Lincoln's case, it will be true in other cases. If I see a child drowning, my desire to help that child will usually be greater than my desire to avoid a guilty conscience. So, see, I mean, what Rachel says there suggests a criticism of premise 4 of our revised argument, right? Because Rachel's is suggesting, in effect, just because satisfaction is one of your goals, that doesn't mean that you're acting selfishly. I mean, if you have some, other non-selfish goal, as, we've argued you have to have some other goal, but if your other goal is non-selfish, and if he seems to suggest, that non-selfish goal is sort of more important than satisfaction, then on balance your action is an unselfish one, not a selfish one. Right? Okay, so those are the two things I want to say in criticism of the revised argument. And yeah, now we could pop over to the slide because I've got a version on. All right. If I can stop coughing here, there are that may be hard. There are a couple more things I want to say about this. First, I think those are the two most important familiar kinds of argument for psychological egoism. So those are the only ones I want to articulate in detail. But I do want to notice that Rachel's run some stuff together that you ought to distinguish in a way that might open up the possibility of a third line of argument. Right? This comes out in the passage immediately after his quotation of the 19th century newspaper story, the middle of 67. Rachel's writes, in this story, Honest Abe employs a time-honored tactic of psychological egoism, the strategy of reinterpreting motives. Everyone knows that people sometimes seem to act altruistically, but if we look deeper, we may find that something else is going on. And usually it's not hard to discover that the unselfish behavior is actually connected to some benefit for the person who does it. Thus, Lincoln talks about the peace of mind he got from rescuing the pigs. The point I want to make here, look, is this. I mean, it's perfectly sensible, this idea of having a strategy of reinterpreting motives. What's a bit misleading about this version of Rachel's discussion is he suggests that sort of the only way to do that is to think of people as aiming for satisfaction. But you can see that that's not right just by thinking about sort of ordinary, predictable reactions to the Mother Teresa example I used earlier, right? So one thing people are sometimes tempted to say about Mother Teresa, which does lead into the argument we've just looked at, is they say, oh, well, you know, Mother Teresa, you know, just did what she did because it brought her satisfaction, right? But another thing people are often very tempted to say is, Mother Teresa did that, you know, help the poor people because she thought she'd get a heavenly reward, right? Because, you know, she thought, you know, in the long run, when, you know, God rewarded her for this stuff, she'd be better off. Yeah? The point there is, look, the second thing is also a version of the strategy of reinterpreting motives, right? It also involves, in a way, saying what appears to be an unselfish motive, namely the, you know, the motive of, you know, helping poor people, right? Turns out, in fact, to be a selfish motive, namely the motive of, you know, trying to make sure that, you know, in the long run in heaven one is as well off as possible, right? So, you know, the strategy of reinterpreting motives need not involve appeal to satisfaction. That's only one way to do it, right? The strategy of reinterpreting motives involves, in essence, you know, arguing that there is a, you know, a deeper unselfish motive that really is what is driving people, and, you know, the apparently, there's a deeper selfish motive, sorry, that's really what's driving people, and the apparently unselfish motive is, you know, too superficial, right? And, you know, the desire for satisfaction is only one candidate to be the deeper selfish motive. There are other candidates as well. Yeah. That's one of the things I think that, you know, that happened when Rachel's condensed what used to be a whole chapter, actually, on psychological egoism into a section, as has happened in the last couple of editions here. Yeah?
I think I see a problem with the satisfaction argument in the sense that psychological egoism says that we're selfish beings. We're inherently selfish beings. Well, the satisfaction argument argues that we do things to be satisfied. If it mentally satisfies us to do benevolent things, doesn't that make us inherently benevolent beings? And doesn't that then contradict the conclusion?
Okay, so that, I think that's to come back to, in effect, the issue about premise 4 in the argument. Look, again, I do think that depends how you formulate the satisfaction argument, right? If it were true that satisfaction were our only goal, right, then it seems to me, you know, I mean, the only thing you're aiming for is satisfaction for yourself. It seems to me very plausible to say that what you're doing is selfish, right? The trickier case is, so that was the first version of the argument. We saw that, you know, there are reasons to think that that's an incoherent idea, that satisfaction could be your only goal. But if it could, it seems to me, you know, there's no problem saying that if all you're aiming for is satisfaction for yourself, that's a selfish motive, right? The trickier case, of course, is the case in which you have mixed motives, right? The case where the motive you have is both satisfaction for you and to help someone else, right? That's the kind of thing that comes up in premise 4 in the revised version of the argument, right? And it seems it's what Rachel talks about, right, insofar as he offers a criticism, right? And then, you know, I mean, it's tricky to decide just what to say here, right? I mean, suppose you can, I mean, look, I mean, suppose it makes sense, you'd have to do some work to see whether it did or not, but suppose it makes sense to say that you can sort of give a relative weight motivationally to each of these motives, right? So, you know, it's sort of a certain percentage of it is, you know, the benevolent thing, a certain percentage of it is the aim for satisfaction, right? So do you want to say, if there's any of the benevolent thing at all, even if it's a very minor part, it's still unselfish? Do you want to say there's a certain threshold, you know, the benevolent part's got to be more than such and such percent, you know? I mean, I don't know, it's hard to know quite how to specify that, right? But I mean that's the issue, right? The issue is what to make of mixed motivation where you have both selfish motive, satisfaction for you, and a benevolent motive to help other people, you know, and then they're both part of the motivational story. And again, I mean, that's, you know, that in what we were talking about, what that, the form in which that comes up is, you know, how to formulate and how to assess premise 4 in the revised argument. All right? What, I mean, you try. I mean, if you think there's something else there that, I mean, so if you think there's a point here that isn't captured by those formulations, right? That's not a matter of what to say about, I mean, whether to label as selfish or unselfish someone's motive when the motive combines a desire for satisfaction and a benevolent motive, right? I mean, try articulating it. We'll see if we can find anything else.
I was just figuring, I wasn't trying to defeat the satisfaction argument on its own. I was trying to establish that the satisfaction argument contradicts the larger theory.
Yeah, but see, I see why you might do that, right? But I do think you're making certain assumptions if you do that. I mean, specifically what you're assuming, if you present it that way, is you're assuming that it can't be true that people are just aiming for satisfaction, right? But of course, I mean, that's what the initial version of the argument says. I mean, granted, it turns out when you think about it that that's not, if Butler's right, that's not sensible, but that is what it says, right? And if it were like that, if it were possible for satisfaction to be the only goal, seems to me there's no problem inferring that action motivated just by satisfaction is selfish, right? I mean, of course, then you have the Butler criticism, then you have the reformulation, and then you're in the, to my mind, messier terrain that, you know, I think you were also talking about, with the messier terrain where exactly the issue is what to make of these mixed motivational setups, what to say about the selfishness or not of someone who is motivated both by a desire for satisfaction and by a benevolent motive in some proportion, right? I mean, because, I mean, look, I mean, it's easy to see what to say about the person who is just motivated by a benevolent motive, right? I mean, you know, clearly unselfish, right? Easy to see what to say about the person who's just motivated by the motive of satisfaction, clearly selfish. But it's you know, what to say about the mixes that's hard. All right. So look, the right thing to think here, and what is what, you know, Rachel's does think, it's that you should reject psychological egoism. Yeah. The initial setup is, I mean, we ordinarily don't think that psychological egoism is true. I mean, it's not that we don't think that people are fairly selfish and often act in self-interested ways and stuff, right? But ordinarily we think people sometimes act unselfishly, right? So psychological egoism has this serious burden of proof to overcome. You know, what the psychological egoist has to be able to do is give you a compelling argument which will show you that despite these initial appearances, in fact, every action really is selfish, right? We looked at the two most familiar candidates to be that sort of argument, right? And we found that neither of them does the job, right? Neither of them is a satisfactory argument. And, you know, given that picture of the state of play, what I think you should clearly say about psychological egoism is it's false. Okay? Now, again, I mean, that doesn't mean that selfishness isn't a problem or isn't a lot of it about and so forth, right? Because again, I mean, psychological egoism, remember, is a very strong universal theory that absolutely everyone always acts selfishly, right? To say that theory is wrong is not to say that there isn't a lot of selfishness about, right? But I mean, that's another issue. You know, if I'm right and Rachel's right about this, and I agree with him about this one, you see, next time I disagree with him actually about ethical egoism, but if I'm right and he's right, you know, the thing to say is psychological egoism is false. So anyone want to raise anything else about this before we conclude it? All right, well, that's good for that topic then, and we'll turn to ethical egoism next time.